Okay. So, good evening, everybody. Before we begin, it is customary to acknowledge that McGill University is situated on land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among indigenous peoples, including Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. And we acknowledge and thank the diverse indigenous peoples whose presence marks this territory on which people from around the world now gather. I am Katrin Tin. I'm a professor at the finance area at the Hotel's Faculty of Management and the academic lead of CIBC's Office of Sustainable Finance at Sustainable Growth Initiative. It is my privilege to welcome you to this symposium on mobilizing capital for nature-based solutions. MIPC, this is the 9th edition of the McGill International Portfolio Challenge, MIPC. And MIPC is one of the flagship initiatives by the Sustainable Growth Initiative, also abbreviated as SGI, which is a cross-faculty initiative at the Hotel's Faculty of Management in collaboration with a set of other parts of McGill. It aims to mobilize academics, students, industry partners, policy leaders to build actionable solutions that can aid in a successful transition to a sustainable economy. SGI, thanks to the generous support of our corporate donors, focuses on several priority themes, which are as follows. The Office of Sustainable Mobility, powered by Alstrom. The Office of Decarbonization, supported by Power Sustainable. The Office of Sustainable Africa, supported by MasterCard Foundation. And the CIBC's Office for Sustainable Finance, which I am leading currently. Aligned with SGI's and CIBC's Office of Sustainable Finance broader mission, the McGill International Portfolio Challenge is an immensely successful recurring event which brings together the academics and industry and provides an excellent experiential learning opportunity for students to tackle real-world problems. This is already a 9th edition, and we had 83 university teams coming from 15 different countries this year. I would like to particularly congratulate and give a special welcome to the 25 semi-finalist teams, many of which are hopefully in the room too. And these teams come from Canada, the United States, Peru, India, Hong Kong, New Zealand, Pakistan, Australia, Lebanon, and Argentina. We are also excited for the first time to welcome McGill students to this competition as well. And this is the first year where we have created a special McGill track. And we had 15 teams from McGill who has responded to this challenge. The MIPC success is owing a lot to the students who are organizing these events, led by Alexia Clamou. So many thanks to her, who was ably led and supported by my good colleague from the finance area, Sebastian Petermeer, who is also professor of finance. And Sebastian is also the one who has a vision. He's a founder and the director of MIPC. So thank you, Sebastian. I thank the organizers and the industry experts who participated at the earlier Women in Buy-Side panel, which was supported by BlackRock, and it took place earlier today. I also thank SGI team as well as other supporting members. So this year's challenge addresses a difficult but important question. How can we mobilize capital to stop the global biodiversity loss, restore nature, and at the same time unlock value creation? This is also the question for today's symposium. And we are thrilled to welcome two global experts in the field. Andrew Gonzalez, who is a fellow of Royal Society of Canada and Librero Chair of Biodiversity Conservation at McGill University, so welcome. And Hee-Chong Song, who is a head of Natural Capital at Clean Energy Finance Corporation. And moderating this excellent debate is again my colleague, Professor Sebastian Petermeer for the Hotels Faculty of Management at McGill University. So thank you for being here, both in person as well as virtually. We would also like to thank Quebec Centre for Biodiversity Science, who has kindly sponsored this event. And I hope that you will enjoy this discussion. Stay for the networking effect, networking event later on. And let me welcome the guest to the stage, and I'll pass it on to Sebastian to lead this discussion. Thank you.
All right, Katrin, thank you. Good morning. Good morning. Actually, it is morning for some of you. It is morning for some of you. Many of you are coming from far away. Raise your hands if you're part of this year's McGill competitors of the 9th edition. Welcome, all of you. You're coming from many places, as Katrin mentioned. It's a real honor to have you. Welcome to McGill. Tradition has it that at every MIPC competition, we open it with a symposium. It's an opportunity to hear from two leaders in the field. It's an opportunity to shape the debates. As you can tell from the case, it's a really, really, really hard case. And so we thought hard, who can we bring that has thought about this topic really hard, has put the topic to practice, and can share some wisdom with us. So as Katrin has already introduced Andrew and Heech, I'll say a few more points that I think are worthwhile saying in the context of things. We have Andrew, an academic, and Heech, who's been implementing it at scale, biodiversity finance. So Andrew has been founding the Quebec Centre for Biodiversity Science here in Canada, has been very much of a thought leader in the field. And Heech at the CEFC, that's the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. Heech is coming from Sydney to join us. The CEFC, it's a major initiative, was created back in 2012, right, in Australia. Since 2012, the fund has deployed close to $90 billion of capital to invest in nature-positive projects. It is a government entity in Australia with a goal to catalyze private capital to decarbonize the country. And they're not doing it through a grants body type of agency. They're actually investing the money with the goal of getting a return on the capital, while at the same time decarbonizing the country. So it's really interesting to be able to discuss with you, Heech and Andrew, having shaped the thought process in the field. How do we think about mobilizing capital for nature-based solutions, and how do we implement it in practice, right? So that's the concept for the idea for today. And the idea is to do it in two parts. Okay, so in the first part, we're going to talk about understanding nature loss. It's really hard to talk about solutions until we've actually articulated the problem, right? So we want to understand nature loss, the relation to climate change. We've talked about climate change before in this competition, but not as much about nature. So let's understand the linkages between nature and climate. The link to economic growth, right? And then we'll talk about the barriers to progress. What is making progress so slow, and how do we actually move forward with this, right? So I have 6 or 7 questions for Andrew and for Heech. And then I'd like to open it up to Q&A. We're going to go until 7 p.m. Then at 7 p.m. we'll go upstairs with a beautiful reception. We couldn't find a better space to have a discussion on biodiversity. This is the Museum of Natural History here at McGill. And then you'll see the full collection once we go for the networking event upstairs. But first, I think I'll start on a depressing note. Right? This, to me, is a killer chart in so many ways. Since 1970, 70% of species have gone extinct, right? Over 2/3. In just 50 years of our life here on the planet, 70% of species have gone extinct. Now, that's scary, right? And it's not just scary for the species themselves, of course, and everything that's going on, but it's scary because, well, it may actually have a real economic loss, and we haven't really discussed it, what that economic loss looks like. But it's gradually coming in. I mean, we're talking about the bees no longer there. We're talking about overfishing, and well, guess what? The ecosystem can no longer replenish itself. And so I guess this will be the first question I'm going to have for you. you've analyzed that topic. Maybe I'll start with you, Heech, and then I'll move to you, Andrew. How is nature loss in your view? What have you seen concretely that have resulted in economic loss from the nature loss so far?
Thanks, Sebastian, and thank you for all of you coming out in this grim weather tonight. But we are in Canada, so something you're used to, unlike Australia. It's a good question, and I guess there's, just stepping back, when we talk about economic loss through natural capital declines and losses, we're talking about what are the assets are we, you have to ask the question, what are the assets are you talking about? It's the natural capital stock of our planet that's used for non-renewable resources plus ecosystem services, all of which are a gift from nature. And with the decline of natural capital and ecosystem services, what are we seeing? We're seeing concretely declines in agriculture yields. We're seeing declines in tourism numbers because the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, for example, with the bleaching, because of climate and man-made activities such as agriculture, is contributing to declines in tourist numbers up in Queensland. And we're also, I think, I would add another dimension to the nature loss, not only contributing to economic loss, but also cultural loss. Because Indigenous Australians, and maybe in your country, are facing declines in access to their deep historical culture through declines in nature loss. So there's, they're the things we're seeing. We're seeing Indigenous people not being able to go back on country in the way that they've used to, and so the continuity of that culture is challenging. And of course, for ecosystem services, declines in yield loss from agriculture is absolutely, visible. So that's bees being one. And I guess another one I would say is the increasing health costs through declines in mental health, declines in access to, pharmaceuticals and alternative medicines, all that come from natural capital. So those costs are real and will also contribute to economic loss. So there's some of the examples I would highlight.
Thank you. What about you, Andrew?
Yeah. First of all, it's wonderful to be back in this room. I used to teach in this room, conservation biology. I know that the seats are a little bit uncomfortable. Hang in there with us. As you can tell, I'm the biodiversity guy, and I'm very happy to be your biodiversity guy for the evening. And I just wanted to build on what Heech has just described, which is a reality that approximately half of our global GDP depends moderately or strongly on the state of nature. And when we see that red line earlier on, that red line shows us a kind of a depressing continuity of the state of nature. And of course, that's telling you that on average, populations around the world are declining, and they've been declining since 1970, our reference. But somehow that doesn't really land it close to home, right? It's something out there. It's almost too big to compute and to digest and understand. And so what this map is showing you is a map of what we call biodiversity intactness. So how many species and their relative abundances are present today in that pixel on the map, in that location on the map, vis-a-vis some historical amount. So what it's saying is that at a scale of this room, we can measure as ecologists the intactness of a community that's been eroded by human impacts, whether those impacts are direct through harvesting or exploitation or climate change or pollution, whatever that is. But I want you to see that the red on this map shows you that we're at 60% intactness. Maybe we've lost 40% of that intactness relative to that baseline scenario. And hopefully when you squint, you can see that the red zones correspond to our agriculture, correspond to those places where we live, where we farm, where we grow, whether that's trees or crops or fruits or whatever it is. And so what this shows is that there is a risk to people and their livelihoods at the scale of this room at the scale of 30 meters by 30 meters. And we can map that using the biological sciences, the biodiversity science that folks like myself do, that's grounded on data that comes from the types of ecosystems you see on the bubbles on the left there. So we recognize now that global biodiversity loss is a local issue, which opens the door to local responses, local measures, and the cumulative effect of those local outcomes that give me reason for optimism. Now, I just want to give you one other piece of stat or information. This is a remarkable figure that came from a study about 14 years ago now. And on the left, it shows you 10,000 years ago, the biomass, how much biological mass was taken up by wild animals, shown by the elephant, and how much biological mass was taken up by humans, which was the remaining 1%. Fast forward 10,000 years, today we've completely flipped it. That 1% of global biomass is wild animals, 67% is livestock, cattle, sheep, etc., and fully 32%, the 7 and something billion people on planet Earth. So we're truly living in the Anthropocene, this human era that's completely transformed our biosphere. Now that means that our livestock, our farming systems, are completely dependent upon this story and this risk here. So the economic risks are obvious because not only is nature that natural capital from which flows are emanating, but if we're eroding nature, if we're deleting species, if we're lowering populations, that means we're lowering those benefits, those ecosystem services, provisioning, regulating, cultural and aesthetic and supporting. So therein lies the challenge, I think, for today is not only the urgency of the problem, but the many scales at which it's happening in our society.
So you've raised, and you've actually both raised the concept of natural capital, right? So we talk about financial capital, we talk about wealth measured in financial terms, we talk about human capital, a bit of the present value of our future wages, which is huge actually compared to our financial capital mostly. But we don't talk as much about natural capital, but you've both actually alluded to it, and you've both talked about the reduction of the natural capital. So when I think of human capital, I think of it as a stock, right? I think of it as a stock. I guess I'm going to ask you to define it, but you think of the stock, the value today that we give to our nature stock that we have. And the idea is, well, given the fact that a lot of our human activity is going to be to take inputs from nature and convert that into financial capital, we're creating value, but we're also, it's not just about value creation, it's about value transfer, right? We're transferring value from natural capital to financial capital. And so, sure, we might get richer, wealthier, but we're actually depleting our stock of human capital. And so, and then, of course, once you do that, then the question is, well, if we deplete it too fast without necessarily knowing what we're doing, we may actually are hurting our next generation because, as you've talked about the value that natural capital can provide, we may no longer be able to draw from it in the future. So I guess this is my next question for you. How should we think of nature capital in our society? I guess perhaps related to that is, have we just been living on credit so far? So yeah, we are getting wealthier, but we're on credit compared to the next generation. And how do we think of long-term economic growth? Can we think of continued long-term economic growth given the fact that we have finite and depleted natural capital? How do we reshape or how do we rewire our thinking with that natural capital? Maybe I'll start with you this time, Andrew.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, actually, take this one. Thank you. Another graphic, which I find very helpful when it comes to thinking about natural capital and the fundamental dependence of our economy and society on it, comes from the Dasgupta report, or the review as it's being fondly known now, but this is a report commissioned by the UK. Many of you will have probably read or seen this report. And of course, this is a very foundational figure you're seeing here, where natural capital is at the base of almost everything in society, not only in terms of the food and the well-being and the biomass, the forests, the crops that we get from nature. But what's crucial here is to appreciate that nature is finite, of course, but it's depreciable in the sense that when we remove species or we change the composition of ecosystems, we lower the capacity of that natural capital to deliver goods and benefits to society. So for example, the UK in 2023 calculated its natural capital. $1.3 trillion of natural capital it calculated. Something like $48 billion per year of services flow from that capital. And so whenever we do that exercise, we realize how foundational this is, but it's not captured by GDP. It's not the lumber that goes through our economy increases GDP, but it's a blind spot if we don't actually calculate the depreciation of those forests that are providing, in addition to lumber, carbon, that is your challenge, the carbon sink, the sequestration of that in real time, but also the species, the old forest, the other nutrient cycling, the soil stability, the flood mitigation, all those other benefits are not being accounted for in our national accounts. And so what Partha Dasgupta was saying, that this is a blind spot that we must fill, because essentially we're not seeing the blue line. The blue line is showing you how those how the natural capital is declining, even while human capital is increasing and produced capital is increasing. And if we're not measuring what's below the line, then we are unwittingly going into debt with nature. Do you want to pick up from there?
Thank you. And I totally echo that. And I think because the blue line is invisible,
Yeah.
the GDP growth is overstated, right? We're not accounting for the depletion of natural capital stocks in how we calculate GDP growth, because we value human capital. We can value it. We value a lot of activities that we produce without taking into consideration the value of natural capital as a feeder into that growth. And because we don't do that, what it means is that we have always seen natural capital stock as not finite. We've treated it as infinite, and that's not the case. It is finite. And so until we start building in the natural capital stock into our economic models and into our calculations of growth, we just won't have a holistic conversation. We'll have this is economic growth. Oh yeah, this is impact to nature. That's not a fulsome, I guess, discussion we should be having. When we're thinking about human activity. The other perspective around credit is definitely yes, we've been living off credit, and the question I have is: are humans good? Are we a good credit? And probably not at this point. We're not, if you were a lender, would you lend us natural capital? I don't know, maybe some nations. But the World Bank, I'm not sure when they produced a economic model, but they had calculated a $2.7 trillion decline year on year on GDP growth until 2050 because of our lack of addressing natural capital as a key input into economic prosperity. Yeah. So just think about that, and think about also their report that says it's actually the poorer nations that will suffer the most because they rely on the natural capital stocks the most. And so the economic inequalities we'll see in the world will just become more pronounced if we don't address this if we don't address this problem we have today.
Yeah, I just want to quickly add to that. There's a phenomenon in my field, biodiversity science, called the extinction debt. Have any of you heard of that term, the extinction debt? Okay, so it's something to do with the time lags. So we tend to, as human beings, we tend to think our impacts have immediate consequences. But in a complex system composed of many, many species, the impact of logging today, or creating islands of habitat in a particular landscape, means that you have this long-term, long-run extinction happening. In fact, we pay the debt of extinction due to current activities for decades, which has consequences in terms of our ability to restore those ecosystems, to restore that diversity, which also takes decades. So this has created this imperative to act now, not only to avoid the full payment of that extinction debt, but to put us on a trajectory to restoring that natural capital that you see on the wall there. And in some of the most celebrated examples of this are when we protect and restore mangrove ecosystems. So mangrove ecosystems are extremely important for many, many reasons. Some of them you see on this figure. Obviously, mangroves are providing incredible buffer against coastal storms and erosion. They're providing diverse habitat for fish species, but not just economically important species, of course, for many, many fish. They're providing fodder for animals, charcoal to sail, and timber for building. So when we think about here the depreciation of that natural asset, the asset that is measured by all of those values on here, and including, of course, those cultural and aesthetic values, then we have to figure out the mechanisms by which we can transform those losses, that story of erosion of natural capital, back into the restoration of natural capital.
So one of the points I found bizarre, actually, in that discussion about natural capital is, for the past 10 years, and I'm not a biodiversity expert, but for the past 10 years, we focus on climate change, net zero. You see funds building net zero targets, countries putting net zero targets. And now it's almost like we have a new dimension. Now we're talking about nature loss, right? And you speak to large institutional investors, they'll have a climate change, and they haven't necessarily thought that deep on nature loss, but now it's coming in, and you can already see from the article there, biodiversity concerns set to be the next frontier after climate change. When I read that, what I'm always finding a little bit weird is like it feels like it's a different dimension from climate change, related but different dimension. But at the same time, though, they're linked, and they have to be linked. You look at degraded landscapes, well, that tends to give you more fires. More fires, that's not great from a net zero type of perspectives. You look at destroyed oceans, if we no longer have the seaweed all around available, well, they no longer store the carbon. So then again, that is linked to climate change. And so we have direct linkages between the climate change and nature loss. And that raises, I think it's a fundamental question. Should we think of nature loss as another dimension in addition to what we've been doing so far? In other words, should we continue to have, let's say, net zero 2030, 2040, whatever that is, the nature positive target in addition? Or should we say, you know what, nature loss is a key driver of climate change, and if we fix nature loss or reverse it, we're going to reverse or bring back we'll meet our goals of net zero. So should we think of it as a separate dimension, or should we continue having one target that might be easier to work with and having biodiversity as a driver of it? How should I think of biodiversity loss or nature in this discussion? Maybe I'll start with you, Heej.
They're very big questions, Sebastian. Not enough time tonight, but I would say maybe they are inextricably linked. That's it is another dimension, in the sense that the way you address biodiversity loss is not necessarily the same as addressing climate change targets. But nature not only is a driver for climate change, it's also a solution to meet the climate challenges we have today. And so when we've set net zero targets, we've really set the targets for industrial corporations to look at decarbonising its operations, right? And we talk about scope 1, 2 emissions and 3 emissions around where's the energy coming from. Transportation is a big emitter. How do we address that? But in that conversation, we have forgotten that actually, to address some of the transition into a net zero economy, we also have to rely on natural capital assets to help us not only meet the climate challenge, but also, address the broader economic dimension to the climate, a low carbon future.
So have we been too siloed in our thinking?
Definitely. So I'll give you an example. So in my line of work, so I'm not a scientist and I'm not a professor, so I feel very privileged to be sitting on in this room. I'm an investor, so it's and so what do we look at? We look at returns. So it's wealth creation, and so to be honest, not that many institutions are wanting to take a return cut to invest into these sectors that maybe don't generate a cash outcome. But so we look at how do we support strategies that meet both climate and natural capital declines. And we do it through the implementation of very simple strategies that are economically viable and at scale. And so reforestation or afforestation is a sector that delivers logs and timber for construction, so you're storing carbon for a very long time. It provides an income for landowners through the generation of, in Australia, carbon credits that are compulsory in the transition. So that really helps to buffer the long-dated nature of the revenue that you get from woodland investments. And it invests in soil and actually people. It creates jobs for local communities. So we are addressing both economic loss and generation and positivity, I guess, through the investments in natural assets. The other thing we're doing is we're investing in what we call carbon farms. So rather than wall-to-wall commodity production or wall-to-wall carbon farming, we are integrating traditional commodity production assets with carbon or natural capital projects that deliver a different source of revenue income through either carbon credits or, in Australia, the developing biodiversity and nature repair credits. And so those are real asset investments that investors can get their head around pretty quickly, because you're really only valuing the land, and it's appreciating land. It's finite resource, so intrinsically it will have greater value in the long term. And what you produce out of that land will depend on the highest and best use at the moment in time for us, and also the conditions where the land sits. So we are competing. We're competing for renewable energy to go on land, food production, timber production, biofuel production. It's all a trade-off. And so if you think of it not in bubbles or
It's very circular what you're describing.
very much so, that is one way to address it. It's not the only way, but certainly one way.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with all of that. It'll be a mistake to silo these two issues. They are separate in the sense that the biosphere and the atmosphere are integrated planetary systems, and we experience the consequences of climate change now on a day-to-day level, whether that's flooding or fires or the emergence of new diseases. But the tree of life has experienced climate change for millions and millions of years. Of course, it's shaped the distribution of biodiversity on planet Earth. And so in a sense, climate is a driver of biodiversity. And in that sense, it predicts extinction risk. So over the last decade, biodiversity scientists have started to pick up the signals of climate shifts impacting on nature, impacting on the productivity of ecosystems and where species are found. This paper just came out last year. It's hot off the press. And what it's showing you now is that we have enough data, the gray dots here on the figure to the left here. And what you're seeing is the prediction from the models that are trained by those data. And it's a pre-industrial rise in temperature to 4 degrees on the left there, and then the predicted extinction risk on the vertical axis. And what you're seeing is something heading from about less than 5%, 0.05 on the Y, to about 1/3 in the worst case scenario. So now we've gone from talking about a few extinctions driven by climate change to fully 1/3 of species that are at risk of extinction. So that is a very powerful driver, and the renewed proximity to IPCC and IPBES demonstrates the concern of the scientists on both sides of the aisle, if you like, the biodiversity aisle and the climate science aisle, that we need to break those differences and start working together for the reasons that each said, is that it's not just that climate is a driver, but nature also in turn drives climate. And so this is some work that we did just a few years ago where we show, well, what are the benefits of mitigating climate change, staying within 1.52 degrees C, as a net positive feedback on our capacity to capture carbon. So back to the circularity point, there are two reasons to slow climate change. One is obviously the immediate economic and health and risk costs of climate change, but also the benefits to maintaining resilient and functioning ecosystems. And so we did a rather large global model of how trees and forests will change under different scenarios of climate change, those different SSP scenarios that I showed in the previous slide. And what you're seeing here, probably difficult for you to see, but in every part of the world, some parts of the world more than others, you see that those little dots are to the right of 0, meaning everywhere in the world there is a net gain to mitigating climate change in order to maintain the ecosystem benefits and that natural capital represented by forests through that policy. And so for us, that was a biodiversity first argument for working on climate change.
So this is fascinating. And it actually raises another question. As you're trying to bridge the two or have a circular, an integrated approach, put it this way. Of course, there's the classic discussion, you cannot manage what you cannot measure, right? Whenever we talk about climate and carbon, right, we talk about carbon accounting, right? So what you see here, this chart is, this is from the University of Michigan. You're looking at all the consumer expenses, whether it's food, goods, transportation, homes. And you can see for each of them, I can create a CO2 equivalent emission. So we're having a carbon accounting. We can take our day-to-day consumption and activity, and we can map it out in terms of a total carbon budget, right? So we have one metric that we can use that can help to quantify our carbon footprint. Okay. So for carbon, we know how to do that. We still have ways to go, but we know how to do that. The problem is for nature. It's not trivial what that metric should be. Right? If I go back to some of the studies on nature accounting, there's about 600 metrics on biodiversity that would potentially be relevant, but I mean, we cannot work with 600 metrics. Right? So that raises a question, can we account for but at the same time, we don't want to be naive, right? And just say, I'm going to get nature in 1 or 2 metrics. And so the question is, can we account for the complexity and value of nature with a few select metrics? Is that a feasible exercise? Maybe I'll start with you, Andrew.
So obviously I'm biased, but I believe it is possible. But I think we have...
Oh, that's good.
We have too long kind of embraced that complexity. We're all natural historians at heart, at least I am. And that means you kind of glory in the intricacies of nature and all those species that are on my tie, for example. And so it's tempting to count every species and every beetle. But in fact, we can be more structured, apply a little bit of scientific thinking to understand what are the foundations that we do need to measure. What do we really, really, really need to measure, right? And so often we talk about species, and we need to measure species because species are the things that are busy in an ecosystem, all right? The species are coming and going, they're growing, reproducing, they're dying, and they are making the ecosystem wheel go around. And so that means that we need to measure ecosystems as well. So we've got the blue disc, part of the disc here is species. Then there's this second component, which is the structure and functioning of those ecosystems, the emergent properties of all of those primary producers, herbivores, predators interacting and modifying the flows of nature. So we do need that ecosystem level as well. And often we'll measure things like the area of an ecosystem, the fragmentation of an ecosystem, the connectivity of an ecosystem, because those are high-level variables that predict outcomes for natural capital and for the ecosystem benefits that flow from that natural capital. But I would say a third and often overlooked dimension that we do need to account for whenever possible is the genetic level, so the red part of the clock there, which is the foundation of adaptability, the resilience of ecosystems, the ability of ecosystems to respond to climate change, among other factors like pollution and invasive species and overexploitation, depends upon us measuring and maintaining that genetic diversity. So my team has been developing a kind of a dashboard like this, a fundamental measure, what we call essential biodiversity variables. Those EBVs are equivalent to the essential climate variables of our colleagues in climate, and we're trying to emulate that. And the idea is that you could pass the pixel over anywhere on planet Earth, like we did for that map at the outset, and show how those different dimensions would change. And then you can build financial instruments on top of that. You can measure the baseline. You can measure the gain or the loss. But through those three lenses, if you're doing well on at least one of the measures of each of those three lenses, then you're building in value at these different scales that we really care about. So this is a photo from an area just south of here where we've been quantifying using various models and methods how an urban area varies from an agricultural area, from a forest, or from a lake, or et cetera, et cetera. So maybe I'll hand the mic back to you now. Do you want to say a few words about measurability?
Yeah, and on that note, you're heading natural capital at CFC, so you're quantifying it.
Yep.
How many metrics do you end up working with when it comes to nature?
Well, it's complicated even for carbon, to be honest, depending on the sector you're measuring for. The great thing about the carbon accounting is it is one fungible carbon unit. So even if the activities that you need to account for are very different, at least it's one unit. It's just very difficult for biodiversity and nature because it is, not, as you say, not one unit that's fungible. But the way you think, I really like this chart, by the way. We can talk about it later. So what we did in a sector like agriculture at the CEFC, because measurement is incredibly important to ensure that we are spending our shareholder, which is public funds, in an appropriate way to measure the impact of not just the decarbonisation impact, but broader environmental impact. So we've commissioned two consultants. If you want to go into consultancy, there's a big opportunity for you. They produced a report on, we call the report Measuring What Matters. So in the agriculture system, it's very complex. You've got production data, you've got broader environmental data, and they all interlinked and interplay with each other. But it is, for financiers and investors who aren't scientists, they need very simple metrics, simple rules, and simple ways to think about prioritising activities.
Then you can measure the portfolio.
Yes, and so we created this framework called Measuring What Matters for the agriculture sector for core commodities, which identifies the key metrics that drive the carbon outcome. And then we sort of map that into, well, what technologies are available today that are able to measure it, and also what's the cost? Because there may be technologies that are available, but it's just prohibitive. For example, soil sampling, proper soil sampling in Australia is incredibly expensive because you have to dig deep holes in various different paddocks, and every paddock is different. So it's costly. So, overlaying, it's a bit like what you've done here. You're overlaying dimensions on how you measure it. And then you can come to some key ones that give you the trajectory of where your carbon is heading, or in fact where your the environmental outcomes is heading. So we're measuring, I guess, the sort of not the preciseness, but the trajectory of key I guess, activities that drive a decarbonisation outcome for sectors like agriculture. And we also did a very similar thing with CSIRO to build a net zero pathfinder tool for landowners to be able to pick it up and work out what are the critical activities that they need to undertake in farming, because they are identifiable, to be able to measure and then proactively act to mitigate that. And so we're putting a financing product to encourage the adoption of these core practices. Now, these are for industries that are obviously kind of well established, but for broader environmental metrics, we're using critical ecosystem services such as agriculture and forestry to expand the metrics thinking around how we prioritise key metrics that those ecosystem services impact. So we're not measuring all sort of biodiversity outcomes in Australia's landscape. We're measuring the impact of ecosystem services to the biodiversity environment, and so we've prioritised that as a measurement focus.
I was going to add a couple more thoughts on convergence of thinking between biologists and economists and think, how do we think about risk and return in nature? And it turns out there's been this parallel world where ecologists have been developing concepts around, for example, the efficient frontier, this idea that you could balance risk and returns, but if you, instead of it being assets in a portfolio, it's species in an ecosystem. And on the left here, this idea that if you diversify an ecosystem, you're distributing this ecological risk, that some species are going up, others are going down, and this sort of the covariance or the synchrony of species is something that humans impact. Not only when we remove a species, obviously we lower the diversity of that ecosystem by doing that, but if you synchronize species, meaning they go up and down together, now you're creating this extra volatility, this extra variability, which we call resilience. And this idea that resilience and productivity are fundamentally coupled in the structure and functioning of an ecosystem is a thing that we're spending a lot of time modeling, predicting. Turns out there is an equivalence at the genetic diversity level. There's a sort of a genetic adaptability volatility. There's one at the species level, and then that translates into ecosystem structure and function. So this is why we can have conversations like this, not just because we're all preoccupied by the state of nature and the state of our climate and what it means for human society, but it turns out there's a parallel, very strong convergence on how we can think about this in the short term and in the long term, and I think that's fantastic.
So this is fascinating because, I mean, I teach portfolio optimization and investments. You're doing the exact same on nature.
Yes, and we do experiments on this. So we create species portfolios in ecosystems, in ponds, in grasslands, in greenhouses, and we're creating the same body of work and theory.
So let's talk about frictions. So we've talked about nature, we've talked about the concepts of nature loss, how it links to climate change, measurements and all this. Let's now talk about real action that we can do and why it's so slow. So you read over and over, we're falling short of our biodiversity goals. We need to act faster. We'll have the COP next week. I'm sure there's going to be another point of discussions on that. What are, in your view, the main frictions? If we're going to go and, again, identifying what are the issues, why is it so slow? I mean, what you've described from a scientific perspective, some of these papers are new, but I mean, a lot of that I'm sure you've been discussing for a while now. Why are not we moving faster?
Maybe I'll take that first.
Yes, please do.
I think fundamentally change is hard. Change is hard. People don't like change. Systems don't like change. And so change management is actually a really important part of how, how we address this friction. Well, it's the cause of the friction. So that's across all parts of our livelihoods. Change. The progress of change needs to be at pace, and so that's difficult. But I guess to quote your current Prime Minister, Mark Carney, he wrote a paper in 2015 and he talked about the tragedy of horizons. So when you think about what does that mean, it means our economic, political, central bank policy horizons are really short term. And the investments we need to make today to stop biodiversity loss, to address climate change, the benefits are decades away. They're for future generations. And that is a concept, and that is a mismatch of where investments need to go, where change needs to happen, to the outcomes we won't see. Like I talked to an Indigenous elder on a project we recently invested in, and he said, the definition of a good person is a person who plants a tree today but will never sit under that tree. And that is fundamentally why we have this friction. We are short-term behaviour. Short-term behaviour is what we've been trained to do. And these kind of investments today we need to make to fix this problem just won't be in. I talk about it in plantation rotation. I think I have one plantation rotation left in my life. That's not a lot. And so I think we need to somehow bridge those horizons to make progress faster. So Yeah.
I had 5 of the causes of frictions, and time horizons was one of them. We hadn't talked before, so that's awesome. I don't need to talk about that. Another is sort of a policy risk, the kind of the flip-flop on the importance of nature and the long-term or short-sightedness about policy flip-flopping. We're experiencing that right now. We've seen the shutdown of the 2 billion trees program overnight. What kind of signal is that sending to NGOs, to municipalities, to community groups around the country? That's one example. The other is this sort of cash flow mismatch between the time it takes an ecosystem to recover, like, the flows of money that have to go into maintaining a viable, restored ecosystem, as we said, is on the scale of decades. Can we maintain income and investment over those time scales? That's number 2, in addition to the third of the time horizons. The other is, I would say, measurability. And so there is a bit of a Wild West right now in terms of the different startups that are trying to monetize how to measure nature. And what we're lacking, what I think, and we fall in the, raise my hand, of sort of being guilty around this, is that we haven't come together as a community to create something like a nature protocol that's equivalent to how we adequately quantified the changing state of nature, but how do we build trust in that process where we all align behind what are the standards. And so I'm currently finishing up this paper right now that brought together about 50 experts from around the world to say, well, what does this look like? Not to propose yet another standard, but what are the features of that standard? So what I want you to do is read this figure around the clock. It starts at the very top on the ethics, on the free, prior, and informed consent, and whose rights are we impinging upon, who are we working with to ensure that when we're measuring the state of nature, that we're doing so from a good place. And then there is the part 1, which is the sensing and knowing. How do we measure change out there in nature, whether that's with an eDNA sample, a soil sample, a water sample, whatever, a satellite orbiting the Earth. There are standards there, but those standards are not well known and adopted. And then we're going around the circle through processing and curation of that data, making sure we care for that data that we invested in, building trust, meaning transparency in how we calculate those values. The best possible analyses and models are being used. We have a rigorous framework for interpreting the insights from those models, and then being sure that we all report on our progress in the same way. And for now, this has not been put together in all its elements. And so you can imagine kind of not everybody can go to the gold standard, can go to the final tier of measurability. So how do we help people to hop on to the process of building this monitoring standard that whether you're a local government, a federal government, a startup or an NGO, we all recognize the value in each other's work because we're measuring these things in the same way and we understand what apples are and what oranges are, and we're not mixing them up. So I'd say that's a very, very important aspect of friction right now.
So let's talk about mitigating those frictions. I'm going to put you on the spot. Suppose that we're November 7th, and you just got called, and you're the new Minister of the Environment. You want to make this a priority, but you know it's politically sensitive. I mean, just here in Canada, we've had a change on the carbon tax just not too long ago, last year. It's sensitive. People don't fully understand the size of the nature loss and how to quantify it. And so I guess the question is, well, what do you do? Now, we're not going to go and take days on this, but if you were to go and push forward 1 or 2 key initiatives that in your view are the low-hanging fruits, and then we're going to talk more about the investment side of it, but first, before that, let's talk about the policy-making side. How would you shape the policy with 1 or 2 key initiatives that in your view would really help to push the needle forward? Concrete. I know it's not an easy question.
1 or 2 initiatives. Yes. This Minister of Environment in Australia has a very tough job. I think if I think about what drives investment in nature or in carbon markets, it is policy. It's a policy-driven market. And so, you know, because of that, there's a lot of hesitancies for investors to enter into those markets because it can also, you know, shift very rapidly and you can lose a lot of value overnight.
Especially for a long-term investor who is...
Exactly. So I think
but you do need policy. They're not, you know, you do need policy to make investments work. So I think the one thing I would do in Australia, at least in the context of Australian policy and current laws, we have a very fragmented environmental policy regime. They sit at both the federal level, they sit at the state level, they sit at the local council level, and they're all a little bit inconsistent. And so that alone creates uncertainty. And what does money hate? Uncertainty. And so we need to have a consistent regulatory policy framing to make it clear. If you're going to create a demand for environmental projects through some sort of tax kind of, disincentive or incentive, you need to make the policy framing clear from state to federal to local. All of that needs to be clear. That's one of the things I would do. Probably the other thing I would do is I would have to create the demand for capital to be wanting to invest in natural capital sort of initiatives. And in order to do that, you can't, nobody likes to say it out loud, but the carbon taxing through a decarbonisation regulatory framework in Australia, the safeguard mechanism, has been very successful. Like we don't call it a carbon tax, but essentially what it is it's a mechanism in which big emitters have to decarbonise year on year, and if you don't meet that budget, you have to acquire compliance carbon credits. And these are real projects, these credits. These are land-based credits, and so it's a reinvestment into landscapes. So I'm very supportive of that framework, and if you could then put another layer of environmental outcomes to that, then I think you will get action. So they're probably the two things I would do.
I have nothing more to say on that. I completely agree. In Europe, we have a regulatory context. We have CSRD. We have a reporting requirement, and that creates a space for that to happen. The maturity of the biodiversity solution space is boosted by that. But I would say there are three other things. The first is very fundamental in society, is the sort of the mainstreaming of knowledge of nature into every sector of society. From our schools, from the earliest moments of learning, I would say biodiversity is barely on the curriculum and is not considered fundamental to being a good citizen, to seeing nature and how to see nature. At a time when we're retreating from nature, we're in our urban environments, we're on our phones permanently, we don't stop and look around us, and we've spoken already about the value of connecting with nature, but the kind of, where the Ministry of Environment talks to the Ministry of Education, that would be an important bridge, not just the Ministry of Finance or Economics. The second is, you all have heard of the UNCEA, the sort of the UN System for Economic and Environmental Accounting, and ecosystem accounts, this idea that we build these ecosystem accounts, meaning we're quantifying what was below the blue line earlier.
Or the GDP loss.
Exactly. So there is a whole system now that was adopted by the UN in 2021, I believe, and Canada actually has something called the Census of Environment. It's one of the early adopters of this natural capital accounting, which renders visible what was invisible. But while I applaud that effort, what has happened is that census of the environment is not connected to real-time information about the state of nature. So they're constantly making calculations from old literature, from literature published in papers. It's not the real-time understanding that our climate colleagues have about the state of weather or climate. Did you know that Canada has never done a formal census of its biodiversity? It does a regular census of its geological wealth on a regular basis. We know where our oil is, we know where our minerals are, but we don't know where our nature is. In fact, there's something called the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, or GBIF. Probably you've heard of GBIF. This is where it's a great big aggregator of all the biodiversity information in the world, and there are 3 billion observations in it. And Canada has about 40 million observations in GBIF. 86% of the observations from Canada lie within 1 kilometre of a road. And 80% of those are for birds. So to a first approximation, we know where the birds are in Canada within a kilometer of a road, which is awesome. It's great that we know where our birds are and maybe some of our butterflies and bumblebees, but how do you build a natural capital accounts? How do you build the census of the environment? How do you educate if we don't invest in our knowledge of nature? And that's foundational to assessing what I think the Minister of the Environment needs to go to bat for. And that's something I'm super keen that we do.
So this is going to be, thank you, this is insightful. My last question for you, and then I want to open up, and by the way, we will have a mic so that since we are recording and live streaming it, if you do raise your hands, please, we'll bring the mic over to you. I'll just mention it ahead of time, if we can bring some helpers on the mics. I want to go back actually to I guess the key theme for today, which is, okay, well, let's bring private capital in now. How do we mobilize private capital in a way that is return generating and in a way that brings back biodiversity, right? And you see some initiatives taking place. I mean, you see, we've talked about carbon credits. We've talked about how to monetize earning money through carbon credits and restoring nature. That's one type. You could also consider return on investments on mangrove, right? Rebuilding the mangroves can bring down insurance premiums along the way, so there's another way to monetizing it. This is really interesting, and you've alluded to it, Heech, on the carbon farms. I love that word, carbon farming. This is very much planting trees and making money from that, because as you said, on the other side, if you have, let's say, some mining companies that are needing to get some carbon credits, well, then they'll be willing to pay for these credits that are then being the result of trees being planted. And that's something, from what I understand, you both do here in Quebec and in Australia. And in Australia, you're doing with LACES, one of the big Quebec funds. So Quebec seems to be involved actually quite a bit in this. What are, in your views, if you're going to be one of the large pension fund, let's say, chief investment officers, as a low-hanging fruit, what are, and I'm asking this because you're both very close to biodiversity, you're seeing what works, you're seeing the economics of it. What are the no-brainer nature-based solutions that perhaps our investment teams may not be aware enough that you would consider pushing forward?
I think, we talk about a lot of capital that's needed in the sector. There is a lot of capital that currently is being allocated to a lot of different asset classes in many institutions. Most of it goes into public markets because of liquidity needs, and and some cash. There is a proportion of investments that are going into what they call the alternatives bucket. So real assets, illiquid, and they comprise of infrastructure assets historically, and real estate assets, private equity, those investments that are seen to be long-term horizons but have stable underwritten cash flows. What's becoming more and more important to these large institutions because of their underlying constituents, their clients, which many people in this room, young people with their pensions being managed by old folk like us, is that you want better social, environmental outcomes with your investments. So we are seeing large funds allocate capital more into alternatives, and what I'd like to see is that allocation going into land-based solutions. We are not seeing enough.
So what do you mean land-based solutions?
So purchasing land to undertake various activities, whether it's commodity production, carbon farming, plantation forestry. There's not enough capital taking, I guess, climate. It's that you take weather risk, you take commodity risk, and the way they think about those investments is it's high risk because those are uncontrollables, and it's a very capital intensive investment. So the returns aren't in the 20% IRRs, they're in the 10 to 12% IRRs, and they don't see that as adequately compensating for the risks that are uncontrollable. So
what I would say as a CIO is actually build a team that's capable of analysing an alternative asset class like land and nature-based solutions in agriculture, forestry and biodiversity projects through utilisation of instruments like credits, carbon credits. In the United States and in Australia, biodiversity credits exist. They are an alternative source of revenue. So how can we de-risk some of these projects through known revenue streams that are longer than annual commodity cycles? And so you need to build teams to do that. So building capability, if I was a CIO, I would build a dedicated team that looks at investing in this asset class. And you'd be surprised, not many do. And the reason why we work with Lacasse is they have a sustainable land management team that sits in infrastructure, and so they have a dedicated team that understands this asset class. So I would say build capability, build a large team, and work out where natural capital assets sits within a portfolio. You know, there's long-term data that is very supportive of it being an inflationary hedge. It's a finite resource, so it's value appreciating. It is not depreciating. So you may have cycles where you might not have a lot of cash year on year because of climate and commodity. But the land that you own has intrinsic value that won't depreciate. So you will never lose the shirt off your back with that investment. It's not like crypto. I don't even understand crypto, to be honest. These are not far-fetched, fanciful investments. These are real assets, and they have real social impact. And for a lot of the pension funds, they're hearing from their clients that they want more of these kind of investments in their portfolio.
I want to just give you a very concrete example. So I was literally at the offices of the pension fund of the workers of Quebec, FTQ, and they have invested in a project that you see on the right there. You can see in the French there, restaurer les coulées agricoles pour favoriser l'adaptation au changement climatique. So this is a project where farmers are part of the solution rather than the problem. What you're seeing there are gullies, unfarmable gullies, steep slopes that are not productive but have not been seen as an opportunity. So my company Habitat started mapping where are all these gullies? How many thousands of hectares are there that could potentially be part of a nature-based solution where it's not just planting trees, you can see it's restored. This was like heavily mowed grass before, and now it's a restoring vegetation of the scale of, we're about 5 years into this project now. And what Habitat does, what my company does, is measure the cumulative benefits of doing that. So it's not just about sticks of carbon, but it's about habitat for threatened snakes. It's about the connectivity that's provided by these riparian buffers, thinking about investment not just in the carbon credit, but in the other benefits that stack on top of that. And what I have argued to the FTQ is that invest in those nature-based solutions that are holistic from a landscape point of view. It's not one patch at a time, but you're seeing the spatial planning that engages small, medium NGOs, small, medium businesses, and in particular municipalities that right now in Quebec are preoccupied by climate risks and nature loss risks.
So since you've both done this, if you were to do it at scale in a way that you identify all the unproductive areas and you were to start being systematic about replanting in a biodiversity compliant way, how much can we push the needle just with that?
I think a lot, but I'm sitting next to an expert who has done it over and over and over again, and this is my first dabble into this process. But we're talking about 10 to 20,000 hectares immediately, and the farmers are like it. They want to be part of it. They see the value of it, the benefits of this in their community, that people want to visit these places. But so far, this has just been funded by loans from the government. This isn't a commercial proposition, and so what the FTQ wants to do is to make this a commercial proposition where we're bringing in investment. And so there, for me, in Quebec, without a regulatory framework, then we're not going to get private investment. And so I think what I would pressuring our Quebec government or the federal government is to reinforce those laws and make this an easy solution.
The other thing I would do as a CIO would also be to request every investment strategy that comes to the investment committee to articulate the natural capital risk and opportunities. We do that for carbon, we don't do it for nature, so that's one way to affect change. But just on this carbon farming platform that we established with La Casse, we actually have $450 million of equity that we're investing alongside with La Casse across both this platform and another platform that we established 2 years ago. And that's just equity. There's no debt in there. You put 30% debt, you've got a lot more equity to deploy into land. So the scale's really important, not only for investment capital, because they want to be able to deploy at scale. Scale's important to achieve the big lifts in carbon and environmental outcome. And so the way you achieve that is through building, aggregating portfolios, and this takes time, and it takes at least 3 years, but 3 years of deploying $450 million doesn't seem a lot, you know, when the gains you get are so significant. So in Australia, at least, the average size of farmland is far greater. It's 2-3 times greater than many other markets. So you're getting already, the aggregation opportunity is good. More than 50% of Australia's land is farmland. So the opportunity sets to, revegetate a lot of these assets, and you're not doing wall-to-wall planting, as I said, is tremendous. And so the first asset we acquired with La Casse was a 15,000 hectare farm, 15,000 hectares in Queensland. And within that farm, there's a diversity of landscape. So we are planting 30% with trees. We're also cropping. We've also got water, and we've also, probably grazing some of the assets over time. So it's a diversified offering of that one farm. And so if you multiply that by 4 farms, we are going to be creating in that $250 million platform approximately 5 million ACCUs, carbon credits, through that project. And that's just one project. And so think about multiplying that, and we're getting into many millions of ACCUs that we need to plug that transition. And this is what it is. It is a transition for many sectors. They don't want to be buying carbon credits. They want to decarbonise their operations, but it's just too expensive, or the technology is not available. So this is a really great way to do it. So some markets are more conducive to scale up investments. Australia is one, which is why La Casse is there.
This is great. Thank you. I could go on and on, but I want to turn over to you. Are there questions, comments, reactions, ideas? Yes, all the way up.
Hi, we're from Sydney as well, so really lovely to hear some Australian examples. Thank you so much. Hello. I just want to ask, in terms of the Australian economy, we're very commodity reliant, which is an incredibly heavy carbonisation or heavy carbon reliant industry. You mentioned towards the end how companies want to move away from carbon credits and want to move towards decarbonisation. How do you see the reconciliation of the progress to net zero targets alongside a very carbon intensive, reliant commodity based economy within Australia specifically?
If your question is how do we reconcile the fact that resources, we're a resource reliant economy, which is very similar to Canada in many ways, which is obviously in many ways detrimental to the environment, and how do we weigh up that with sort of these type of opportunities? And if that's your question, I would say the resources business companies like Rio Tinto that we work with, and we worked with them on this transaction, and BlueScope Steel, big steel manufacturing, all of those resources companies are needed in the energy transition. Wind assets, solar assets, all of the technologies, AI, data centers, big cables that go underneath the seabeds for connectivity plus energy connectivity requires these resources. So they're not renewables though. There's renewable and then there's non-renewable natural capital resources. They're non-renewable. So they have to be managed carefully, but those businesses are wanting to decarbonise its operations so it has as least impact to the environment as it's mining. So Rio Tinto, for example, most of their emissions actually come from transportation. Heavy vehicle transportation, very hard to decarbonise quickly because the technology on electrification is not quite there. So they're looking at alternative fuels, right? Can they use alternative fuels to as part of the transition? So I would say that the critical mining, non-renewable resource sectors are front and centre thinking how to decarbonise its operations, but they recognise it's going to take a long time. So, the investment into carbon farming kind of projects, I would say, because it's their investments that's creating the carbon credits. I see that as not as an offset, but actually a reinvestment of what's needed in looking at this as a holistic problem: climate, nature, and obviously industry. So it's there. I see them as contributing to the rebuild of the natural resource base that they are essentially mining for profit. So we don't tax them enough, so we may as well make them pay in the restoration.
Agreed. I have nothing to say on that.
Hello, we're also from Brisbane, Australia. Hello, Sydney. My question is, we had the opportunity to sit down with the second largest stockbroker in the country, and we kind of pitched the case to him, and he kind of laughed at us and said, I know my portfolio manager isn't looking at biodiversity when making investment decisions. So do you believe that this has to get really bad for people to take it seriously, or do you believe it has to become a trend of a sort?
Yeah, that's a real life observation and probably truer for many investors. And don't forget, people in equities are very short term. They're liquid assets. They're looking at 12 months is a long term horizon. When they're looking at equities, I think philosophically you're probably right. Things have to get pretty bad for people to go, oh, holy moly, we better act now. It's sort of what happened with COVID, and we know the world can act when there is an absolute crisis that impacts all of us. But I think the opportunities for people like yourself and the young people in the room to be advocates to the institutions that your wealth is being managed, to say you want more investments to be directed into various sectors. You're seeing that in Europe. APG, a very large investment manager for APB's pensions, they have an incredibly strong sustainability lens in their investments because of their underlying investors. So you can advocate for that change yourself. In Australia, we are seeing investment managers pop up that are managing funds with an ethical lens, not just climate or environment, but broader social impact. Australian Ethical Investors is one, and they manage both equities, portfolios, and real assets to meet those broader impact outcomes. And the key to their success to date has been measurement. They can quantify the impact, and they not only screen it for that impact, but they then report against it, and they report the economic outcomes against it. So it's a slow movement, but it's happening, and we're seeing large-scale pension funds also participating in that. So I would say, don't ignore that person, but don't let that think that things are going to never change, because we are seeing change happen.
Well, I'd only add to that, how sad, but I think what has to happen is a transition in the psyche, the zeitgeist, that biodiversity is not this just long-term, we're going to lose 70% of the biosphere, but that it's event-based, that extreme events are nature-related or underpinned by nature, whether that's insurance of flood effects or fire effects, whether that's the emergence of tick-borne diseases in Canada or in Europe right now, where the health risks are on a scale of seasons, right? It's sort of shortening the time dimension, so to speak, where I think we have failed to communicate effectively the severity of biodiversity-related issues. That we are saving pandas, we're saving whales, we're saving koalas. We have to do that. But actually the underpinning of society and its foundations on nature and the speed with which nature is changing, that's probably not going to convince that individual tomorrow. But I think if coming back to this mainstreaming idea that I was talking about earlier, if we started mainstreaming the whole story, that might shift the needle.
Hey, great talk. But I was hoping to get into, or dig a bit deeper into the market solutions for protecting nature. As we saw, it's a big market failure that we're not protecting nature. I think the UNEP wrote that it cost out $500 billion to protect nature by 2030 and up to $900 billion by 2050, and yet $200 billion being mobilized to protect nature, and 80% of that's through public funding. So from my perspective, having market-based solutions to actually bring money to protecting nature is a huge opportunity and frankly needed to be able to save biodiversity and accomplish what we want to. So I was wondering how biodiversity, whether it's the MRV side or appreciating assets, kind of what are the case studies or concrete kind of next steps that we should be thinking about, or maybe what you're excited about for, kind of catalyzing and accelerating the market-based or market solutions for protecting nature.
It's a good question. There is a market failure, but that's because the investments in natural capital to date have been through public funding. So now we've sort of said we actually also need private funding, and so it's not so much that we're fixing a market failure because something hasn't worked. What we're trying to do is create market instruments to crowd in private capital where public purses run out of money. And so, a really interesting example of some big financial institutions like Citigroup are doing is they are lending money to emerging countries, emerging nations, in a swap for nature. So the country that's borrowing money from Citigroup, in return for that coupon, they have to deliver a environmental outcome. So they've issued nature swap kind of bonds for the protection of certain rhinos, very specific outcomes. And they're talking billions of dollars into nature swap kind of strategies. But it is for emerging markets. The emerging markets need help, but equally developed markets need capital too to reverse some of the damage. And so that's harder. And I think for developed markets, the instruments that that are available have to be supported by policy. It's the only way. And so you can't just conjure up a financial investment model or an instrument that will solve this, because it just doesn't exist. Because nature itself just does not give you financial returns in the same sense as, you know, a widget factory. It will create risk and economic loss, which is potentially measurable, but is it going to give you an income at the end of the year? Only through certain services. So you do need policy intervention to generate essentially a market for that outcome. So, and we're seeing that in Australia with the Nature Repair Act. We're seeing that with, you know, the rolling kind of credit system of the Australian carbon credit market. So it's starting, but policy is critical to support the finance sector to deliver private investment, is what I would say.
Yeah. I think it's that issue of de-risking at the beginning. When you plant thousands of trees, millions of trees, and 90% of them die, you know, you're not going to get any growth from that in the long run. For a pension fund that's looking for whatever, 5-6% growth, that's not going to happen just by planting trees. You've got to affect communities. You've got to work with, there's an innovation around how you restore ecosystems. How do we do that well and at scale? One of the most, I'll give you a particular example. I was approached as a biodiversity scientist on the MRV side, was something called Blue Coastal Studio. This idea that in the north of Canada, blue carbon in the form of kelp and seaweed is also a source of food, a source of potentially pharmaceutical products, and you're layering in the innovation around the investment in nature. But you're doing it with coastal communities. Some of them those are indigenous communities. And so there's a lot of interest from the private sector, kind of a blended government-public permanence idea, plus investment in the technology and in the growth that's available from the kelp market, the seaweed market. And so I was asked to say, well, Andy, how do we do this? How do we measure this reliably and do so in a way that's similar across communities so you can show the lift, the uplift, that net positive outcome? And that's, well, yeah.
So we're running out of time. I can see 2 questions here. We'll ask them together, actually, if you don't mind. Let's get them quick, and then I'll let you both respond, and then we'll close.
Thank you so much for your sobering insights so far. This past summer, I learned that some questionably ethical investments like tobacco have very high returns because everyone is divested from them. And I know that for like Canadian oil pipelines, for instance, the argument for developing them is the fact that if we don't develop it, somebody else in the world will develop them and then make money. And as we know, in the world, there are a lot of like conflicts politically between, like even if we come up with a policy and really stick to it, another country might not. And at the end of the day, whatever's done in that side of the world will affect us too. So I'm wondering like how you would account for such like global geopolitical risks in your models quantitatively.
We'll take the second bet.
Well, first of all, thank you for joining us today. We're really grateful to hear from you. My question is a bit more technical. Talking about restoration projects, so to be short, sure, we're spending this much money, we're restoring this much of this unit of species, ecosystem, whatever, okay? And you're selling that for a certain price, which is cost plus a certain markup, right? A key issue that is being raised is, well, when you're selling this, you're claiming that you're selling this at this price because you restored this much. And now people are asking, well, how much of this restoration or of this improvement would have naturally happened? How much of this improvement did you do?
Counterfactual?
Yeah, so how much did you do? And I guess my question is, can credit certifiers account for that very tangibly, and if so, how?
I'll give both of them a stab, and then we'll, let me see. I'll start from the back. So the counterfactual, the causal understanding of all this is really challenging because we're layering in multiple drivers of biodiversity loss and multiple drivers of uplift, whether that's climate, local microclimate, or regional continental climate. And so what I have been reading a lot about and working on is something called a kind of a synthetic reference. You have to create a reference ecosystem against which you're comparing, as you know, I'm seeing from your nodding. And how do you do that when you don't have long-term data for a particular ecosystem that could serve as your reference? alluded to, birds and roads. We don't really know very well how well our ecosystems do. And so this is where models come into play. So you can build in the data, create some confidence, and create these reference counterfactuals that allow you to say, okay, with a certain degree of uncertainty and with a certain degree of statistical power, I can say that this has happened, this amount of uplift has happened, and right now that is not the state of the art. That is still in the ivory tower. That's still kind of being researched, and what we need to do is rapidly accelerate the landing of those methods into those schemes. And it's something we're doing with this project on the right now, because we know very well, we have a chronology of these forests, and we know what a reference forest looks like. But we have to apply these models to do that. Which takes me to that question. We call this kind of this distant responsibility, this telecoupling between countries. So if you think about the impact of a Canadian through the choices that we make, either as a society or as individuals, to the coffee we buy, the chocolate we buy, whatever, turns out you can quantify that supply chain impact. You can go back to the source of where we've destroyed that habitat for that crop, let's say, if it's a coffee crop or a chocolate crop. So Canadians have 7 times the global average due to just that remote responsibility. And we're just starting to create the models that allow us to identify the pathways. So which countries are coupled? And once we know the embodied impact on nature of those trade decisions, then we can start to ask that ethical question, is how do you modify trade agreements to account for that impact on nature? And so they're in the early days. We're just sort of building those up. Those models, having trust in them requires good data, understanding what your reference is. And so I'm super excited about that particular opportunity right now, where there's a need for state-of-the-art science, and they're building these useful models that can inform trade negotiations.
I'll start there as well. That's a really, really good question, and actually something that has become an issue in the Australian carbon credit market. And I go back to the credit market because the carbon credit market is a really good proxy to see how nature credits can develop over time. So we had a lot of controversy around additionality, around carbon projects where they were literally locking up agricultural land and letting it to regenerate. So there was a lot of discourse, science, law around whether they were truly additional projects. And so it had to do with how long ago the land was cleared, how much of that vegetation would have regenerated anyway in any event. So all of that led to a big review of the carbon credit market in Australia, the Chubb review. And the conclusion was that, yes, there's probably some projects that are not great. But for the most part, it wasn't the method that was not great. It was just the measurement, verification, reporting process could be better. And so that project is no longer now a viable carbon credit unit project. That project is being replaced by, that method is being replaced by another method they're looking at, but that'll take time. So trees is something that is very measurable, it is modelled, it can be verified. So that's probably where we're very much focused on. But I think on your question of, what is that baseline that you're measuring from? And in carbon, it's easy to measure because day one, you can measure your baseline. The broader ecosystems, harder to measure. But there are enough measurement, metrics out there that you can measure your asset. So as an asset owner, you can start baselining the key areas. This is why capital is important and institutional capital is important, because you have the time and the money to bring in experts to help you measure that. So we're doing that. We're measuring environmental and carbon emissions as a baseline across all of our investments day one. And then we are applying science and production, different production to, have a better outcome in carbon and have a better environmental outcome. So we're measuring that year on year. So at the very least, what you can do is measure your baseline of your asset. You might not be able to do it for the whole nation, but you start there. And one of our investments that we're sort of 7 years in, we've got really good data out of 5 years. And so this is why the tragedy of Horizons is so real, because you know, when you're going into that investment, were you happy to wait 7 years for the measurement to showcase? Well, we were, but it's very hard for other institutions. But you know, it doesn't answer all your question, but it answers. You know, that's the way we think about it.
Thank you so much, Andrew and Heech. Let's give a round of applause. Right before we go upstairs for the reception, I believe we have especially some folks hearing us on the live stream. We are going to announce the winners of the online semifinals that took place this morning. In fact, I'll pass you on the clicker.
All right, so what an incredible discussion, first off. I'll try to follow it up to the best of my abilities. But welcome everyone to the 2025 MIPC virtual final announcement. My name's Owen Paniello. I'm one of the VPs of the University Relations team. And coming into the competition this year, we really wanted to focus on two things. First of all, preserving the hybrid model that we have in place, being able to engage the immeasurable talent worldwide, keeping it as flexible as we can. And second of all, we also wanted to create an opportunity for McGill students to be able to participate. And that's why we created the McGill track, and we're excited to see them present tomorrow in their final round. With everyone's hard work, we stand here today, closing night one of the 9th edition of the MIPC. I know it's been 9 years, it's pretty crazy. And this morning, out of 83 teams worldwide, 10 were selected to compete virtually in our semifinal round. This weekend, 38 different judges across 13 different firms, graciously took time out of their days, to come here and give valuable feedback to our students. So we appreciate that. And finally, to our student team, our mentors, faculty, and even the dean, everyone's hard work really culminated together and made this event, ultimately what it is. And after the judges' careful deliberation, and thorough evaluation of all 10 outstanding presentations, we're ready to reveal the two teams that really demonstrated exceptional skill in both Pool 1 and Pool 2. Here we go, and from Pool 1, we have Vanadium Partners from Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad. Awesome, now moving on to Pool 2, we have Aurora Capital from Auckland University of Technology. First off, a big congratulations to all the finalists from Pool 1 and Pool 2, and we really look forward to hearing your final presentations tomorrow, and we'll be in touch shortly to send you your time slot and other logistical details as well. Now, getting into the best speakers for Pool 1, we have Yuri Tao from Team TSIC from University of Toronto. We have Ahmed Asher from Earthonomic Capital, Lahore University of Management Sciences. And lastly, Gavin Brody from Team TSIC, again, University of Toronto. Now moving into the best speakers from Pool 2. We have Kelly Nicholson from Aurora Capital, Auckland University of Technology. We have Victor Vistotsky from Evergreen Consulting, University of Alberta. And Ernesto Aguirre Vela from Team Olive Tree from Pontificia Universidad Católica del Perú. Forgive my Spanish, but... Again, big congratulations to all the best speaker nominees from both Pool 1 and Pool 2. So now, get excited. It's time for day 2 of the MIPC. And I invite everyone to watch the finals broadcast tomorrow, beginning at 1:30, or better yet, come to Armstrong in person on the 3rd floor and watch it live. Additionally, at the closing ceremony, the winners of the competition and specialty prizes, such as Best Quantitative, Best Storytelling, and Most Innovative, will also be announced. Updates will be posted on our social media, so stay tuned on that. And again, once again, thanks for everyone for coming out and supporting the MIPC. And now for at least my favorite part, let's go enjoy some food and drinks on the 1st floor in the museum. Thanks, everyone.